You mentioned Cleopatra. If we go back to that, what role did she play? Another fascinating human being.
Cleopatra is interesting. I mean, she was a direct descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy. When Alexander's empire had broken up, Ptolemy, this general, had seized control of Egypt, made it his kingdom. And she, 10 generations later, is a descendant of this Macedonian general. So Egypt had been ruled by, in essence, foreigners, these Macedonian dynasty of kings, and often they literally were ruled by the same dynasty because they had a habit of marrying brothers to sisters. And Cleopatra is, in fact, originally married to her younger brother. But despite that, she seems to have intensely identified with Egypt. In fact, she seems to have been the first one of all these Ptolemy kings who actually bothered to learn to speak Egyptian. So she seems to really have cared about Egypt as well. And she was clearly very smart, very clever. And so she's living at a time during the late Republic when Rome is having all these civil wars, and Egypt is really the last big independent kingdom left around the shores of the Mediterranean. Everything else has been conquered by Rome. So she is in this very precarious position where clearly she wants to maintain Egyptian independence, but Rome is this juggernaut that's rolling over everything. And she ends up meeting Julius Caesar when Caesar comes to Egypt chasing Pompey, his great rival. After he defeats Pompey, Pompey runs to Egypt thinking he'll find sanctuary there, and the Egyptians kill him and chop off his head. And when Caesar lands, they hand it to him and say, "Here, have a present." And she, of course, famously ends up having a love affair with Caesar. Was that a genuine love, or was she just sort of, using this as a way to try and keep Egypt independent, to give it some status? We don't know. After she does have several kids with Caesar. After Caesar's assassinated and the Roman world is having another civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony. Mark Antony is basing himself in the East. He meets Cleopatra, and he has a big love affair with her. And this one seems pretty genuine. Antony and Cleopatra, there's a lot of stories about them kind of partying together. They like to sort of cosplay and dress up as different gods. So Cleopatra would dress up as the goddess Isis, and Antony would dress up as the god Dionysus in a leopard skin, and they'd have these big parties and stuff. And they end up together fighting against Octavian. And in the end, they're defeated by Octavian. And Antony commits suicide. Cleopatra, there's differing accounts of her death. She may have also killed herself, or she may actually have been killed by Octavian to just get her out of the way. But she's an interesting figure because she was clearly a very smart woman who managed to keep Egypt alive as an independent state. She seemed to have actually cared about Egypt and identified with it, and succeeded at a time with all these famous people, in being a real kind of mover and shaker and a force in events.
I mean, she's probably one of the most influential women in human history.
She's certainly, again, she's someone that her image is incredibly important.
Yes.
And I mean, one of the interesting things, the whole question of gender in the Roman world, I mean, this gets into Roman sources, but of course it's a heavily male-dominated history. And I mean, men and women did not have equality in ancient Rome. It's a male-dominated society. It's misogynist in many ways. But what I'm constantly struck by is when you start, again, delving into the sources, you always hear, okay, well, there was this one woman who was a philosopher, and she's an exception to the rule. And yeah, okay, she's fine. And then you start looking into, and there's also 60 other female philosophers. Well, is that so much an exception anymore? Or, Cleopatra is the one queen. She's this strong queen. And then you look and, well, there was this other queen here. There was this queen here. There was this queen here who led armies. And here's another one who led armies. And again, it's like, well, are they exceptions to the rule, or is just the history that was written, which is written by men, a little bit selective in how it portrays them? Because the sources are all these male elites who have very definite ideas about women. The conventional notion has always been that, business in the Roman Empire was a male field. Well, but then there's this woman, Eumachia in Pompeii, who actually had the largest building in Pompeii right on the forum named after her with a giant statue of her. And she was a patron to a bunch of the most important guilds in Pompeii. Okay, she's the exception to the rule. Oh, but then there's these other 4 women we have from Pompeii who also were patrons of guilds. And then there's this woman, Plancia Magna, in this other place. And she was the most important patron in the town and put up all these statues. So at some point, when do you start to say, well, maybe women did play more of a role, but they just haven't been recorded in the sources in the way that maybe they deserve to be?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Is it the bias of society, or is it the bias of the historian? The bias of the society that the historian is writing about, or the bias of the actual historian?
And the bias of the historians who have written history up to this point.
Yeah.